Hi everybody, welcome back to week 2 of Phil 375, also known as Tortoise Week, because we are looking at 3 different readings, all of which involve tortoises in some capacity. Before I start with a brief introduction to those, I wanted to just mention a quick couple of administrative things. Firstly, about the discussion threads. So folks were asking things like how long they were going to stay open and when exactly they should contribute during the week. The answer is that they will stay open until the next week's threads go live. So when I upload this video on Monday, I will take down the old threads and open the new threads. You'll still be able to read the old threads. They won't go away, but they won't be open for new comments anymore. So if you want to get your comments in there before Friday, then I can use them to inform the weekly wrap-up audio that I make on Fridays. But if you don't have a chance to do that and you go in over the weekend, you will still be able to contribute something. And of course, if you want to, you can contribute more than once. And if you go in after Friday and you want to respond to things that are in the wrap-up audio, that's fine as well. So there's a bit of a kind of back and forth dialogue between, the intro video, the thread titles, your commentary and conversations about those, my audio wrap up, and then you can go back into the comments if you want to and respond to the audio wrap up. And then on Monday, I close that discussion and we open the new ones. So I hope that's all clear. This week, we're talking about 3 pieces that I've chosen for a reason. It's not just that I like tortoises. I think they are pretty cool, but that's not it. It's because I wanted to think about the use of kinds of literature to do kinds of philosophical work that are not quite the stereotype of a philosophical novel, in maybe the a tradition of Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, which we'll be looking at later. That's very classic in every respect as a piece of philosophical literature, but there are lots and lots of other ways to use all kinds of literary forms, and particularly today we're going to be looking at short stories, in some cases very short stories, and what they have been used to do, what they can do. And of course, we're not going to see the full range here of what they can do, but I wanted to pick out a few things that are perhaps just not the most obvious kind of things that when we think about philosophy and literature. Okay, so actually I'm going to start with the Paradox of Achilles, attributed to Zeno of Elea, and hopefully you've all had a chance to read at least a little bit of the background of what that is. It is a kind of, you could call it thought experiment. It's something you're supposed to, it's a little story you're supposed to read and think about and realize something that maybe you hadn't realized before or that you hadn't thought about before. And the way that Zeno was using it, the intention was to trouble our ideas about motion, and to make us think that there are contradictions or paradoxes in the very idea of things moving. Whether or not that's the correct lesson to draw from that short story is a discussion perhaps for another time. For our purposes, the interesting thing is, what is the relationship between that story about Achilles and the tortoise and the moral or lessons or philosophical points that we might take from it? So what's the relationship between this little piece of fiction and philosophy, really? I mean, in this case, the relevant kind of philosophy is metaphysics, I suppose, the metaphysics of time and space, or motion, the relationship between time and space and objects in time and space, or at least our usual everyday ways of thinking about those things. What's the connection between the story and the metaphysics of time, space, and motion, and things, objects in space? That's our question. And I guess there's also a sub-question here about what the connection or relationships might be between a short story and a thought experiment, more generally. some kinds of thought experiments might look more like short stories, others might look less like stories. They might look more like a description of an actual experiment where you just don't have to go and set up the equipment in a lab. You could just imagine it in your head. So when we think about literature, we might be thinking about either kind, but really the obvious thought is to look at the short story kind and say, what does that tell us about metaphysics? What can it tell us about metaphysics? So under this heading, we're going to look at things like how does the story work to raise a metaphysical challenge or problem? Does it succeed in doing that? At this point, I guess we might start to get into some of the substantive philosophy around the Achilles Paradox. But for most directly, the question is like, what's the mechanics of how this is working? Why is this so famous and successful that thousands of years later we're still reading it and learning things from it or thinking about it as philosophers? Okay, so there's our first example. The next thing I'll talk about is the Aesop fable. So again, a piece that has its roots in the ancient past. So Aesop, just in case anyone doesn't know, quick Google will be your friend here. But Aesop was an enslaved person who lived in ancient Greece, 600s to 500s BCE. And of course, we don't know a lot about who this person could have been. He is, however, referenced by ancient historians, so there's good reason to believe there was somebody like this. But what happens is that he tells stories and these sort of enter into oral tradition. And over time, more and more stories come to be attributed to Aesop that are of the same general kind. So this sort of simple fable with a simple moral. And there are other patterns to the Aesop fables as well, like they tend to involve animals. They tend to tell the kind of moral truth that you could teach to children, that kind of thing. So the version that we're looking at is actually the language, the text. I'm not sure if there's even an attribution given there, although, of course, Aesop didn't write anything, certainly didn't write anything in English, so somebody must have done the English language here, but the attribution for this text is actually to the illustrator of it, which is Milo Winter. So possibly they did the text as well, I am actually not sure. But the point is, there are hundreds and hundreds of different versions of the Aesop fables, and so there are many, many different specific ways to tell these kinds of short stories, little tiny stories. And we're just looking at one as an example, a kind of classic contemporary type of example of a telling of an Aesop fable, and specifically the one with the hare and the tortoise in it. And so again, here, what I'm trying to do is think about what kind of philosophical work the story could do. And so in this case, we're most directly and obviously not being told something about metaphysics necessarily, but something about maybe how to succeed at life. So the moral of the story, the race is not always to the swiftest, or however it's phrased. There are lots of different ways you could put that, but being the quickest or the fastest is not always the best way to succeed or to win the race or whatever it is that you're trying to do. These kinds of morals are they're not exactly necessarily ethics, although some of Aesop's fables do deal in obviously ethical truths, but they're more like pragmatics of how to live a good life. And so the kinds of things that have really kind of stood the test of time, stuck around in people's minds, because it's the kind of moral you might want to pass on to a child, that you want to have a good life. You want to tell them, look, you don't always get where you're going fastest by rushing at it like the hare. Sometimes you need to be the tortoise. I think lots of us could actually, still benefit from hearing that on a regular basis. This is actually one of my favorite of Aesop's fables, and I do really, really very strongly identify with the tortoise in these kinds of contexts. It's for children. This version is actually, I think that the collection is called the Aesop for Children, and there's something interesting that's being done with a story like this that maybe is less true of Zeno's paradoxes, which is the sort of accessibility, universal or near universal accessibility in terms of understanding the story and what it's supposed to convey. Understanding the paradox of Achilles might take a few more years, but this one you could start very early in life with understanding the moral of the hare and the tortoise. So in a sense, these are for children, but in that other sense that I mentioned that a lot of us might feel like we need to hear this quite often, it's not necessarily just for children. In a sense, the fable, this kind of fable has become a kind of cliche of one of the types of philosophical literature, certainly ethical literature, the simple story with a very obvious and often explicitly stated moral at the end, the moral of the story. This is one of the cliches. So I'm just kind of hanging that label on it, not as a criticism, because you're not to blame for the cliche if you invented it, but to sort of notice what it is so one of the things we can do with this is notice what it is that makes this genre a cliche now. And then if we want to think about in our own writing how we will move beyond cliches, how will we move beyond this kind of cliche? There are lots of ways of doing that without necessarily leaving the genre behind. So if, for example, we were to turn to something like George Orwell's Animal Farm, you have a lot of the same elements in play, right? There's a simple story with animals, a pretty obvious ethical or political, maybe both, conclusion. In that case, not quite explicitly stated, although skirts the line of being pretty close to being explicitly stated. And in some sense, you could tell the story to children, right? Animal Farm could be understood by children. They don't necessarily get that it's a reference to world politics and communism, but they will be able to understand what's happening with the pigs and the horse and the donkey. I hope everyone's at least vaguely familiar with the gist of the plot of Animal Farm. If you're not, again, a quick Google be your friend. This is very well covered on the internet. So, yeah, this is a kind of fable type story that moves beyond the cliche, moves beyond Aesop, and using a lot of the same mechanisms that Aesop is using, but in a much more sophisticated way and a much more adult way, or at least universal way, maybe still comprehensible, at least for some of the story, some of the lessons still comprehensible to children, but obviously intending to address adults as well, primarily. So that's one way you can move beyond the cliche. We're not studying Animal Farm, but we are looking at Lewis Carroll's article about tortoises, because we're sticking with the tortoise theme. So Lewis Carroll, let's just move there next. This is another way I think that you can go beyond the fable cliche, and you can tell a similar kind of story to a fable, but in a way that makes much more subtle and rich and deep philosophical points. And so this Lewis Carroll article, which just in case anyone's not sure, this is that Lewis Carroll, the same guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. But here he's writing in the journal Mind, which is a very famous and well-respected, very serious philosophy journal. It's also one of the oldest. So he was writing this in, I think it was I've got it written down here, 1895 this was published. So Mind has been around since then. The journal Mind, not Minds, they've been around a bit longer. But the journal called Mind has been around for a long time. And Lewis Carroll, as well as writing his fiction for children, like Alice in Wonderland, was writing philosophical journal articles, and indeed books of mathematical logic, including a logic textbook, which is just a straight-up logic textbook that was used to teach introductory symbolic logic to students. So anyone who's done like a Phil 220 class here, he was basically writing the textbook that you would use for that kind of class, although the 19th century equivalent of Phil 220, which was a bit different. So yeah, Lewis Carroll, multi-talented individual. It's actually a kind of a connection that you can still see in the contemporary world, I think, between the very geeky, technical, mathematical or scientific or logical people and the people who love to play with whimsical, sort of geeky, fantastical fiction. And nowadays you might see it as someone who's maybe a mathematician, but they also run D&D campaigns, Dungeons and Dragons, on the weekends. This is a kind of pairing of skill sets, including philosophical logic, with fiction, including especially fantasy, that for some reason seems to be very common. You see it quite often. So yeah, Lewis Carroll was like that, and he's using a short story here to tell us something about how reasoning works, how deduction from premises to conclusion works, or maybe doesn't work, depending on how you read the moral of his story. So he's making a point about how difficult it is to really get someone to accept something using logic, and not just for the obvious kind of Reddit-related reasons that you can make a perfectly compelling logical argument and the person might just refuse to accept it. It's not it's not quite that. It's more specifically Lewis Carroll's more specifically pointing out that anytime you have an argument that goes A, if A then B, therefore B, you can always say, well, what if I believe those two premises? I believe A and I believe that if A then B, but I don't believe B. Then maybe I need to also believe that if both of those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. But now that if statement looks like another premise, so you add it into the bundle, and then you can run exactly the same move again. And you get what's called an infinite regress. And what exactly is the moral of this story is still actually a very live debate in contemporary epistemology and philosophy of logic. So this is, although this was published in 1895, it still regularly appears on philosophy syllabi, and not just ones like this that are about literature, but straight up epistemology and or logic syllabi. So, what's the connection between the other ones? Again, not just the tortoise, but the use of simple stories about, in this case, tortoises, to make deep and interesting philosophical points that have the capacity to stick around for hundreds of years or more. Now, obviously, Lewis Carroll's much closer to contemporary than Aesop or Zeno of Elea, but 100 years is a good life for a philosophy paper in mind. For someone to still be reading your mind paper 100 years later, you've done a really good job. Something about that has really worked. It's really stuck with people. It's really hit home. And actually later in this course, we'll be looking at some even more contemporary... Oh, hello. This is Seven, my Sphinx cat. Later in this course, we'll be looking at some even more contemporary examples. And actually, we'll look at Graham Priest, who is a contemporary logician and metaphysician who wrote a very short story to make a point about impossibility in fictions. And again, it's one of these kind of whimsical, fantastical short stories. So, okay, what else do I need to tell you at this point? I don't think Seven's come to tell you something, teach you some sort of moral about not needing to conform to the stereotype of what a cat is. There you go. She's not a fluffy one. She's the other kind of cat. Okay. yeah, I don't think there's anything else substantive that I need to mention in this video, and I don't want to ramble on too long. I'm going to open 3 threads, and I think what I'll probably do is one for each of the readings, but of course feel free to, and I encourage you to make cross comparisons between them. And I will see you back on Friday for the wrap-up, and I'm looking forward to see what everyone has to say about tortoises this week. Anyone got a tortoise as a pet? That'd be pretty cool.